folks. Welcome to Fabric of Folklore. I am your hostess, Vanessa Y. Rogers. In this really nerdy folklore podcast, we dive into all aspects of culture. We love stories like folk tales, but also customs and rituals and holiday practices. All the things that make us feel connected to our country, our community, our family, our businesses, our friend groups. These folklore traditions help to define who we are and what is important to us. So if this sounds like a podcast that you would be interested in, definitely hit that subscribe button today so that you are getting your notifications every Tuesday when our podcast comes out. So definitely hit that subscribe button. And today's show is going to be so cool because we're talking to Ben Stimpson about two practical folklore applications, how folklore mythology is used in therapy sessions, and his new book, A Guide to Building Ancestral Veneration Practices, which is basically a how-to guide for connecting with your ancestors. So Ben Stimpson is a therapist, a lecturer, a student, and a spiritual director. He's developed courses on a variety of topics, including ancestral veneration, the power of story, and folklore. When not working with clients or writing, Ben is engaged with his area of study, religious studies, medieval and classical studies, folklore, and spirituality. So thank you so much for joining us, Ben.
Thank you so much. I was actually really excited to see you pop up in that group because I've been really wanting to do more work and more interviews around folklore because it's such an important part of my life. So I was really pleased. Thank you for having me on.
I'm so glad that you messaged because I have never heard of doing therapy with folktales, and I just think that is such an interesting application. So I definitely am excited to talk about that. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey into how you got into psychotherapy to begin with?
Oh, it's all interconnected with all aspects of my life. So I was originally training in social work back when I'm a little older, I'm 36. And when I was 18, 19, I started studying social work up here in Canada. And just something just didn't feel right about it. I was starting to really dread going into the field. I slowed down a little bit and I saw people who had been graduating ahead of me start to burn out really quickly. So I was really dreading it. But what I ended up doing was I took some time away, and in the intervening years, I discovered this beautiful program in Toronto. It was a spiritual psychotherapy course. And it's funny because I was aware of it even while I was studying social work, but I didn't think psychotherapy or counseling was on my radar. It wasn't even something I was kind of drawn to. But the reason I was wanting to go into social work in the first place was people used to come to me to listen to them. I'm a listener. I'm one of those listeners, And so the reasons that I didn't want to go into social work was I saw it as a band-aid solution to issues. A lot of it is based in systemic issues. It doesn't really, there's no feeling that I would be helping anybody. And so then when I started doing this course, I saw that I could directly help people help themselves. That's really what psychotherapy is. I'm not helping the person. I'm creating and facilitating the space for them to do their own work. And the particular course I did was great because I had a very powerful model. I started doing some self-development classes by somebody who was the kind of a satellite campus of the program in a place called Kitchener. And she was practicing spiritual psychotherapy. She was practicing archetypal psychotherapy, which we'll get into. But she was very connected with both the pagan community, alternative spiritualities, but also the power of story. And around that same time, I was also engaged with a spiritual group, a spiritual working group of about 150 people. And we were heavily working with Joseph Campbell's The Monomyth. So what we were doing was we were crafting living stories that we could all enter into and engage with around that theme of the monomyth. And I was chosen to be one of the principal characters. So it was a wonderful introduction to this way of looking at both myself in a work, but also the role and power of story in the first place. around that same time, all these things were all interconnected. All around that same time, I was also live action role playing, which, if you haven't heard
LARPing,
of it,
right?
is it's LARPing, yeah, exactly, which is very similar to what I was doing with the spiritual group, but the lens was more fantasy gaming, right? So it was interesting kind of then seeing the interconnections between all of these things, how some of the players I was playing with in LARP used their characters and used their story as a way of coming out of their shells, of discovering pieces about themselves, exploring themselves through this kind of pseudo character, while also in the spiritual group and when I was studying psychotherapy, how then the potential of story, and particularly folklore and mythology, can assist. For me, in that realm, there's no distinction between kind of popular culture, superheroes and fantasy, and mythology and folklore, because the one came from the other, right? So that's kind of how
I have several questions. Okay. So when you say that you choose characters, so explain again how you're living through a character with the monomyth. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yes, of course. Absolutely. So the monomyth, Joseph Campbell's monomyth, I'm sure you're aware of it. Some of your viewers might be. So Joseph Campbell is he was a theorist. He passed away about 10 years ago, I believe, and he started looking at comparative mythology and started to see similarities emerge, especially around the way of how heroes come about. So his most famous work is The Hero with a Thousand Faces. He could see that in many of these stories, there was similar plot lines. He basically took the same methodology as how we would study folklore now, with the motif index and the archetypal index, and applied it to story. What's interesting, what people don't realize, is that he was actually a protege of Carl Jung, who is one of the major founders of psychotherapy in the world. So there was that connection there. So his idea of the monomyth then is that there are, depending on what list you look at, but there are various stages. And the movie Star Wars is a very good example of that. In fact, George Lucas really connected in with the monomyth idea. So this idea that an individual, through circumstances, is brought from innocence, an innocent state, into tragedy, and through tragedy and working way through, going into the shadow, coming back out as an experienced individual ready to re-meet their monster. So oftentimes monsters are, at least in this way, in the psychotherapeutic model, monsters are inner monsters. Monsters are challenges that we have and face in life. Anything that shakes us out of normal, right? So the way then that monomyth was taken, and if you look at like a lot of fairy tales, same thing. Red Riding Hood. She's just going to go and visit Grandma. What does she discover? Grandma's being gobbled up by a wolf. The wolf is the enemy. And so then through that process of despondency, Red Riding Hood is able to then defeat the wolf and save Grandma, who is still alive.
That was not the American tale, but yes.
Yeah, it's true. Yes. So then with the monomyth group I was working with, it was called Tribal Hearth. We were looking at the role, almost like the tarot journey. When you look at the tarot, very similar. The major arcana of the tarot follows through this archetype as well. It starts with the fool, the innocent, goes all the way through various different archetypal cycles, and comes back to that place of the hermit, the empowered one, all of it, right? So the monomyth, at least, and there is criticism of it. I will acknowledge that there is great criticism of it. But from a purely kind of within its own standpoint, what we would do then in this spiritual group is we would create large ritual plays, like a mystery play. And every single person at these events would have a role within that mystery play, even if it was just to, be kind of a background character or to be a witness to what's happening. And then through that mystery play, we would explore kind of then entering into these paracosms. Tonya Luhrmann, who is an anthropologist in England and the States, has this idea of the paracosm, which is a created kind of mini universe that people engage with. Whenever you're watching a television show and everything else just disappears and you're just focused on that television show or that play, the magic of the theater is a paracosm. You enter into the story. In this way, we were literally entering into the story by taking on the characters that we were playing in these roles. And then afterwards, we would have a debrief. What was that like for us? What did we experience? What did we notice and witness ourselves and others doing in these shared spaces? There's a certain level of hypnosis that goes on as well. We take on different aspects and we look at ourselves in a different way while playing these characters. And then the intent in there is very important too. The intent is that we're entering into a sacred story space. It's not just like LARPing where we know that, people are just playing characters as for fun. It's actually a spiritual intent there. So that's what we were doing. So it was kind of interesting then to kind of have all these three parts intersect and then equip me for understanding the deeper implications and connections between story, self, community, and kind of.
So you sought out a spiritual based therapy program. Have you always been a spiritual person?
I would say so, yes, and that's that really ties back to my own story in connection with the UK. So I'm originally from the UK. I grew up in North Wales, which is a beautiful land. It's literally King Arthur's land. There are castle ruins all over the place, Roman ruins everywhere. So it's really a very special place, And so when I came to Canada, I was 8 years old when I came to Canada. I was disconnected from my homeland, my sense of self, all of those pieces. This ties into the ancestral work that I do too. So then I really latched on to folklore particularly and mythology particularly because it reminded me of home. When I grew up, there was my parents had a load of books on Welsh mythology and folklore, and just the landscape of being over there. Like it's very easy to turn a corner and imagine that you might come across a witch or a fairy ring or whatever, right? So these were stories that I had grown up with anyways. It was on our television all the time. And so I really latched onto that idea of folklore and story in general, and the idea of spirits and monsters and gods and saints and all of this. And for me, that gave me comfort because what I was really dealing with was cultural trauma. I was dealing with culture shock when I was younger. And so I really latched on to, and then it just became a natural kind of extension of what I love and how I see the world. So then how the spirituality piece came in was I had this love of folklore, but I wasn't really sure what to really do with it other than, something interesting in my life. And around 13, 14, I came out as gay and I was suddenly surrounded by churches that didn't seem to want me. But I had that expressed need for a spiritual connection. And so I found neo-paganism, and neo-paganism tends to use a lot of folk ways and folk tales and mythology as part of their synthesis. So then it became more than just that element of story. It became something much bigger. And I think in many ways a container that I could find myself in.
What a story. How fascinating. Yes, absolutely. It is so interconnected. I find that in my own life, like, different parts end up coming together and fit so nicely. I really, I've been thinking about, when I'm doing this podcast, I really enjoy having, I love the folk tales, but I really love when we intersect completely differing, what seemingly different subjects together and they come together so nicely. And you wouldn't think, like, we had someone come on and talk about medicine and folklore, and you wouldn't think that those two would have anything to do with one another, and yet they fit really nicely together. So I love that your story just kind of
that dynamic.
Puzzle pieces.
And this is the thing. This is the little soapbox that I have. I think Western culture and our modern culture tend to see folk tales and folk life and folk story, even mythology, as being unreal because they are flying in the face of the modern belief that we exist with, which is the scientific rationalism, right? If you, going back to a previous guest of yours, Dr. Simon Gronmer, he said something very, very important in his interview with you, which was that it isn't just about the stories that hillbillies up in the woods have, right? Outside of us, right? Folklore is folk life. Folklore is everything. When you really look about kind of how folklore operates, I know you've had guests who've talked about that too. Folklore is a container that is non-sanctioned, that is community-based, that is community-focused, that is empowering of community, and is the container for all sorts of different pieces of knowledge. I think in the pagan community, the big issue is that oftentimes pagans will look at folklore as being only a spiritual thing, and so they gravitate towards those spiritual pieces. I think in the secular community, it's for entertainment, so they'll gravitate, people in general will gravitate towards stories for entertainment, versus and psychological. So this is also a soapbox moment for me. The psychological issue is that a lot of psychotherapists and anthropologists will then go to the psychological view. Well, what does this mean psychologically? What are these symbols? What does this mean to the community? And yes, there's those elements, but in all of those, I think they're all missing the other components, which is solid belief. This isn't just a symbolic thing. This is how communities actually saw the world, and we need to understand that because that's important for those communities. There's a spiritual element there. There's an entertainment area component there. All of those different pieces. So it's all encompassing, and that's, I think, why studying it from the outside, folklore studies, as a discipline often can miss out on pieces because it depends on what lens. When you're living in a culture, you're understanding those interconnections so subconsciously that it doesn't matter to you to necessarily be aware of those connections. They just are, right? Yeah.
No,
so
I love it. I love it. So, okay. Let me see. I've lost track of my questions. Okay, so tell us how in a therapy session it would work for you to use folklore.
Absolutely. So folklore in particular, first of all, it depends on who I'm working with. I find, I niche particularly with the queer community and the kind of neo-pagans, alternate spirituality community. And oftentimes, the way that I would use folklore is the same way that I would use other forms of story, and we can get into that later on. But what I'm particularly interested in, and what a lot of my clients are interested in, is that inner work through looking at external. And so it's that relationship between how is the individual taking in and relating to a particular story. I work a lot with narrative therapy. Narrative therapy is all about the stories that we tell ourselves, how our stories are relating to the stories socially, and as folklore, as actually folk culture contains narratives outside. If you look at spirits and figures and monsters and saints and folk heroes and all of them are relevant and still continue to be talked about in a folk culture because they inform us about what that culture actually is promoting. What is the shared identity there? And so really when I'm working with folklore or other types of story, folklore in particular, I'm looking at how is the individual connecting their personal identity with the identity of the group. So what I'm finding what's happening in the queer community right now, particularly with people who are under, say, 35, 40, is that there is a real interest in witchcraft amongst queer people. Particularly queer, kind of non-binary and individuals who are exploring gender expression, because the witch particularly is such a kind of non-gendered individual, right? I want to say, I'm trying to choose my words carefully because there's so many different ways that witches are taken. 20 years ago, in the goddess spirituality movement, the witch figure and archetype was a form of female empowerment because it represented kind of a post-menopausal, kind of sexualized version of what womanhood could be. And so then it became a space that an individual could then fill with their own self. You know, everybody's a witch then, right? So with the queer community in particular, looking at kind of how witchcraft and how kind of folk stories are taken up, what figures become important, and how then to work with that story. So I sent you a list earlier. One of the main people who I really learned from around this was Dr. Carol Pearson, who wrote quite a few books. One was The Hero Within, and it's the idea of particular stories and mythologies, such as like the story of Dionysus, or the story of Apollo, or the story of Hermes. How does an individual relate, and how does that archetype, fit into them? What is that like as a personality trait? So there's another piece there about personality traits. But I'll give you another concrete example. I'll try to be careful so confidential information isn't shared. But I had a client once who he was very interested in the Norse gods. And he was particularly interested in working spiritually with the god Tyr. And Tyr is, at one point, Tyr was a much larger, more important deity in the pantheon, and then somehow it shifted in the stories. What we have left, Tyr was demoted to a kind of a secondary character. And Tyr, his most famous story is he placed his hand into the mouth of Fenris, who is the wolf child of Loki. And this was as a way of showing Fenris that he was honorable and that he would be willing to sacrifice his hand if the gods double-crossed Fenris. So he places his hand in, and the gods double-cross the wolf, bind him so that he can't cause havoc anymore. And of course, he bites off Tyr's hand. So Tyr becomes the one-handed warrior. So at that point in his life, the client, that story of sacrifice and having his hand bitten off, not physically for him, but emotionally for him, was a big part of what he was dealing with what we were working with. And so I said, okay, well, let's explore that a little more. How do you think Tyr would have felt in that situation? So we looked at the story. We focused on the story, and we focused on kind of then how the client would feel if he was Tyr in that situation. And through that process of projecting onto an external source in order to then look and explore, he was able to make connections in himself. And so it's that connection piece. And, this isn't the only example. There are many, many individuals who, we all have our favorite kind of folk tales, right? I'm sure you have your favorite folk. What's your favorite folk tale?
The first one that I remember connecting with is the legend of the Bluebonnet. And have you heard of it? It's a Texas legend. And it comes from, I believe, the Comanche tribes. And basically it's a little girl, and she is an orphan, and the tribe is starving to death because they don't have food because it hasn't rained in so long. And so someone goes to the mountain, and it's decreed that someone needs to make a sacrifice, but no one wants to make a sacrifice. And so this little girl who's an orphan, who has one doll with blue feathers from a blue jay, and that's her only possession that she has, she sacrifices this doll that came from her parents for her people. And then it rains, and the world is covered in blue bonnets from the feathers from the blue jay, and she's then upgraded in her tribe as the one who saved her people. And it's just a beautiful tale. And I think it really connects, because it was told to me as a child, and it really, I'm not an orphan or anything, but it really connected with me that she was able to make such a sacrifice when she only had that one thing that connected her to her parents.
That's a beautiful story. I have heard of that. Studying folklore, it's like all these stories in my head, don't necessarily pop up. But I haven't heard that. I have heard that story before. It's what struck me when you were explaining that to me and telling that to me. There were certain parts that you became really exuberant about. Right? The idea of sacrifice and the idea of the Bluebonnets all the way through. When you first heard that, what captivated you about that story? Do you think?
I find things hard to let go, I think. And so that's the sacrifice would have felt really hard for me. And so I think it was just kind of astonishing that she would let that go when she didn't have her parents anymore. And it was, the only thing that connected her with her past, the physical thing. And so that was what connected me, I think, to the story.
That's beautiful. Do you find even now you sometimes find yourself in situations where you're reminded of that story?
Yeah, I mean, every spring, Texas is covered in bluebonnets, and it's beautiful. And so it's easy to be reminded of that story on an annual basis because, it's a physical reminder all over the state.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. I'm going to have to tell some of my Texas friends to take pictures now.
Oh yeah, well I have a blog post about that legend, and I'll put up a couple pictures of the bluebonnet fields in this podcast, because it is gorgeous when it's covered in bluebonnets.
That's beautiful. What I love about what just happened, so even within that one story, and again, how you were explaining it, we see the interconnection then of explaining the world around us, right? Connecting in with those themes of sacrifice. So you're having that direct connection with that character. But the story is also probably used as a way of understanding, well, why are all these bluebonnets everywhere? And so you entered into the story, right? That's the defining feature between fiction and folklore, is that we enter into the story and we have a different relationship with the story, because the story can be seen to explain why all these bluebonnets are everywhere, right? It creates more magic in our life, right? And dissolves that fourth wall. So that, I think, creates and allows individuals in therapy, when working with these stories, because the fourth wall isn't there anymore, to have a much deeper connection. The kind of social scientific rationalism piece dissolves, and we can enter into a more intimate space, and that space leads back to ourselves, right?
Why do you think that folklore does that over fiction? What is the defining?
Well, I think. No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Very good question. So I think there's nuance to it. And I actually speak about that in this book here. So the book I wrote is about working with the ancestors. And a large part of this book is also to expand that concept of ancestor. Could a fictional character be seen as ancestor? Could the sky be seen as ancestor? I think that it's that continuum piece, right? I think that, it's not a real versus unreal. It's that division of realness. It's that continuum of realness. So if, for example, folklore tends to be posited to us and taught to us as this is how things were, right? This is actual reality when we're very young. When we are very young, we have characters in our lives who are fictional that are very real to us. I certainly have a whole pantheon of characters that I grew up with that, for me, are real. And I think most people have that. It's that childlike understanding of reality in a different sense. When we're older and we know that somebody has written a story based on whatever it is, but it's fictional, then we tend to have a different reaction to it. But if you look at historical fiction, for example, and you're reading historical fiction knowing that these individuals, although this is a fictionalized account, these are historical individuals, we can I think people enter into the story in that way differently than if it's like a, really bawdy, badly written romance novel, right? Where we know this would never happen, right? So I think it comes down to believability. But I think that going in, if we know, and especially if we can see who's created it, that unbelievability piece kind of comes in to create an issue. But I think, again, it's a continuum of belief. It really depends on where on the continuum it is. I'll give you an example. King Arthur, right? A lot of people swear that when they're walking around ancient ruins in England, they have that sense of Camelot could be just around the corner. When you actually look at the development of the matter of Britain as a container, a lot of the elements that we think of now classically as being Arthurian are inventions. Lancelot did not appear until, I believe it was 1140s. So, Thomas Malory in the 1400s added a lot of details. Geoffrey of Monmouth, who earlier created the Regnum Historiam Britonum, which is a very highly fictionalized idea of what the history of Britain was, again created a lot of details. But does that necessarily matter when you're in an ancient castle in England and it becomes foggy, or when you're in Glastonbury and you're looking out across the mists, right? Does that matter? No, because the believability is still there. So I think that then there's that. I think there's a distinction. We can't see it as an real versus unreal. I think there's a sense of that, that continuum of realness.
Yeah.
If that answers the question.
I actually forgot what the question was.
Oh, sorry.
So when you are with so your therapy sessions, are they usually one-on-one? And so do you typically start in the fashion that you asked me? What is a folklore, a folktale that really resonated with you? Or how do you know what folktale will resonate with them?
Absolutely. So this comes down to, first of all, how I promote myself and how I kind of posit myself. Knowing that people come from certain communities and backgrounds, I can be more open with them. I first have to really understand what the issues are first. So when starting to work with somebody, it's more traditional, just allowing them to vent. The first couple of sessions is really for me to get a sense of who they are, how they maybe be seeing things, because I work a lot with the idea of lenses and subpersonalities. Subpersonalities are those pieces, of those people that we become inside ourselves when we're presented with certain situations. They're us, but they're forms of us, right? So I want to know kind of who this person is, what is the issue, how are they relating to that issue, how are they perceiving the issue, before I begin to even go into working with story. I think also it's not necessarily specifically just folklore, it's story in general. Because I'm a narrative therapist, I'm interested in how stories are connected. And so as soon as I start to work with somebody, I get a sense of, based on their age, their background, kind of how they're promoting themselves, shifting themselves, and like showing up to the sessions. How open they might be. With one client, I might go the folklore route because I know that's an interest of theirs. If they're coming from the pagan community, or they seem to be very interested in ancient mythology or folklore or stories, right? Then I'll inch towards that, and I might then suggest that we focus on that. With another client, I'll give you an idea. Knowing a little bit more about their background, I might suggest then a fictional character, but it's the same process. So one of my favorites is, particularly with the young queer community of under 25, is the TV show Steven Universe. Steven Universe ran for 4 seasons I think it ended about 3 years ago. And there's a lot of characters in there that are representative. And very similar to the Monomyth, Steven goes through a whole, from innocence to tragedy to experience. And so there's a lot of cultural connection to Steven in that. And big themes of who do you want to become, who are you now, what is the pressure on you in society to conform, a lot of themes about conformity in that show. And so with one client, that piece around conformity came up, and so I asked them, are you a fan of Steven Universe? Oh yeah, I'm a fan of Steven Universe. Okay, this particular character, what was your relationship with them? I've actually done that with couples before. There's a single character, there's a fusion of 2 other characters in that show, and they're interrelated as a singular being, as a relationship. And so I've worked around that archetype. So it's working with character and story in that way. So it depends on kind of where the background of the person is coming from. I find a lot of my pagan and alternative spirituality people and clients, they tend to be more interested in working with folklore and folk story that way. But I am actually developing a course on this, which is creating your own world in the same way of like the never-ending story. So creating a folk landscape for themselves, populated by all sorts of different spirits and deities and gods who are actually representative of their life on the outside. So I'm using those elements and the structure of folklore and how folk life and culture is developed and the structure of it to then
so
do
then
inner work.
In this course, would you go through your own past and create a story that is a metaphorical journey that like you went through as a human? Is that what you...
Absolutely. That's exactly it. You would design an inner landscape that is a symbolic representation of your life, right? So, which is when you look at, say, when you look at many spirits from folklore, that's exactly what the community does. The community had that layer of, because folklore to me is different layers on top of each other, right? A layer of symbolism there. Mermaids, for example, had a very strongly religious symbolic interpretation attached to them, and that's why they became so popular in stories, because they had that symbolic element. Same with if you look at ancient Greek, the idea of the hybrid creature. Each part of the hybrid creature, especially in like medieval folklore, had a symbolic element, and together then they represented particular issues in society that needed to be dealt with. Dragons are the same thing. Now, they're not just symbolic. There are many stories where they are very, very real, and the creatures could exist in a certain place that children are not to go to because they'll be dragged under and killed, right? So there's all those different layers.
How are
right?
mermaids spiritual?
So mermaids in Europe, particularly England, there's two big major Christian allegories. If you go into a church in Cornwall, there's I think St. Tudno's. There is a beautiful carving, ancient carving. It's about 400, 500 years old, on one of church pews. And the way that the Christian church, on a local folk religion level, which is different from the official way of seeing things, is that mermaids are symbolic of Christ because they are of two worlds. They are of the sea. They are also of humanity, right? And so they represent Christ in that way. And because of the symbolism of Christ as fisherman and his connection with fish, and the fish as a symbol of Christ, the mermaid as part fish is also part Christ, right? There's also quite a few stories connected about the transformative power of Christ on particular individuals. The one in St. Tudno, I believe the story is that she was actually a Brittany down in France, which is a Celtic-speaking region of France, was cast adrift. She was a princess, and she was cast adrift by her people, and in the little boat in the middle of a channel, capsized, and she was transformed into a mermaid because of her faith, and that's why she would sometimes be seen coming onto shore and going to church to mass. There's also an Irish saint, a mermaid saint, and her name is Liban. And Liban's story is in Loch Neve, which is the giant. I butchered that. I apologize, but it is the giant freshwater lake in the middle of Northern Ireland. There. Apparently that was a land at one point, and local legend says that land was so wicked that God came in and destroyed it. Very similar stories all over Europe of God coming in and destroying wicked lands, right? And the only one who was pure was the princess, the young princess, and she went in and she was shut in to I think it was like a chapel, and then God flooded the land. She and her dog were the only ones who survived. Now, for 400 years, she was down there, still alive and still shut in there, and through that process, she had actually been turned into a mermaid. and her little dog was turned into a sea otter. And so then they emerged, and when Christians came to that area, I believe it was St. Patrick who came, saw the mermaid, saw Liban, and saw that she'd been saved because of her piety, and made her into a saint. And so there is actually a church. If you look up Liban, there's a beautiful Catholic icon of Liban emerging out of the sea, and she's a saint. She's Saint
How
Liban.
interesting! I've never heard that.
Yeah. It's wonderful. And so with that, then, this is why we know that folk culture is a lot more than just story, because what you're doing, what was happening in those specific two examples was that you had local folk culture trying to assimilate a worldview that was external to themselves, right? These mermaid creatures were around a lot longer, right? I know you had somebody come on and talk about selkies. The belief in selkies and belief in mermaids go back a long time. And then you have this Christian worldview that seemed to then create issues. Like they don't seem to be compatible, and folk culture is where compatibility is formed, right? And this is any folk culture that you look at around the world. You'll have official religion, and you'll have folk religion. Folk religion is actually where all the syncretism usually happens, right? So it becomes very interesting, those connections. And what it is it's community trying to assimilate useful external information or worldviews, but ground them into a local level.
So folk religion versus organized religion. What can you give me a more concrete example?
Yes, of course. So if you were to go up into the Ozarks, right, you have Protestant churches all over the place. You have a small Catholic community there. Same with Appalachia, right? But you have all of these little denominations that have sprung up around things like snake handling, right? Which is, I would say, folk religion, because it comes from a very particular thing in the Bible. And of course, snakes are everywhere in the Ozarks and Appalachia, right? But it's that localized folk interpretation of that, as opposed to something that has been taught in seminary in a more official capacity. And in that way, what's happening is it's being grounded into the local locality, right? Another good example of this is Mormonism. So when the Mormons came from New York over to Salt Lake City, what they saw in the landscape around them was a landscape that was very similar, at least in description, to Israel. So you had the Great Salt Lake, you have the mountains, you had a landscape that seemed to be very, very similar to the Holy Land. So then they saw this place as the new Holy Land, right? So that is a local, I would say, and I know the Mormon Church would not like me saying this, but that is a form of folk culture. It's a localized interpretation of official religion that then evolved to become more official than it started out with.
Yeah,
Does that make
absolutely. Sense? So this therapy that you're doing, is it considered experimental? Is it recognized in the DSM? What is it called? Yeah.
Right.
Is it
Absolutely, very good question. So, archetypal therapy actually goes right back to Carl Jung. So, Carl Jung, Jungian therapy and psychotherapy. It is a soft science. It does not treat or focus on mental illness. It focuses on the other ways that we show up. So narrative therapy is on how we, the lenses that we see our world through, how those lenses evolved. There's a connection to something called systems theory, which is understanding human development as a product of the systems that we're born into, and the interpersonal dynamics of the individuals attached. So if we look at folklore would be a systemic systems. You could see it through the lens of systems theory, because there are multiple elements that have evolved within a cultural development that are used for various different ways to educate, to self-identify, to inform individuals about themselves and also about the community, right? So it wouldn't be connected more with kind of mental illness side of mental health. This is more about self-expression, the nurture aspect versus the nature aspect of psychology. If that
And
makes sense.
can you talk a little bit about any research that has been done on this particular branch of therapy?
Absolutely. So, research. There's a load of different researchers who have developed theories. It's considered soft science because, unlike a hard science, it really depends on the individuals involved. This is more of a form of cultural science than it would be. Necessarily a hard science looking at biochemistry or whatnot. I do know that Dr. Carol Pearson, whose background is in, I believe her background is in biomedical science, in looking at the archetypes as personality traits. She approached it from that view of looking at comparabilities studies. The issue with culture is, and this is one of the issues why systemic testing is not a good thing, is that from culture to culture to culture to culture, ideas of common sense, ideas of self, ideas of community are very different. And so, if you look at the South Asian or Middle Eastern context, personal identity is not as individualistic as North America, and so they don't tend to see themselves as individualistic the same way that we would in North America. So it's difficult to look at and test these things. But I would say that from a productivity piece, it would depend on what you're actually looking at gaining. So if it's to do anything to do with mental health, CBT, DBT, they produce recognizable results that can be generalized. When it comes to this form of therapy, results vary considerably, right?
I did come across a study that I found really interesting. It was done in Sao Paulo, and it was not for therapy, but it was done to help reduce pain and stress. And it was, I don't know if you're familiar with it. It says storytelling is twice as effective as playing games. And they did this experiment on 81 children who were in the hospital, and they had two sets of children, and it was, games were helpful, but the folktales storytelling was twice as effective as the storytelling. I guess it distracted them more. They felt less pain. Their cortisone levels were, what are the cortisone levels? Are those the ones that increase your stress?
The serotonin, yes, the released, right? Yes, yeah. If I'm not knowing the study, I would suggest it strikes me that when you're engaged in a really good story, it creates those pleasure centers in the brain, right? It creates that focus. It can also create that placebo effect too, right? The studies around meditation, guided meditation. So one thing that I do, like ASMR, for example, right? When you're listening, have you ever done an ASMR, listened to an ASMR track?
Is that the one where they're
so
like whispering
ASMR track
and doing like,
whispering in, exactly. So there are actually quite a few ASMR channels that create different realities that people can go into and listen. So a very popular one right now, she dresses up and she's a witch in the woods, and she's using mortar and pestle, and you just there's something about being in a grin, losing that fourth wall. You enter into that story, and in that way the mind is able to then relax, because it's, first of all, a safe environment, because it's not the physical environment that you're in, but it also can be designed and manipulated in order to create a relaxed state. Something that I have done during the pandemic was and it's on my YouTube page if people are interested. I did a guided meditation using one of Brothers Grimm's stories, the woman in the woods, and how I wrote it and how I spoke it. It was an ASMR. I might redo it just because my microphone was terrible, but it was, you are walking through the woods and you hear the sound of the birds and you feel the chill of the early morning dew, and you see a shack in the distance, and you walk towards the shack and you open the door carefully as it creaks open, and so on and so on. You're placing the individual in the story, and one of the or quite a lot of the feedback I received was that they could literally feel themselves in those places. It's the idea of a placebo effect, right? The power of the mind in order to project ourselves into spaces that our physical bodies are not there.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. So what tools does this type of therapy give to individuals? Because I know in therapy, a lot of times what you're gaining is tools to deal with your challenges. What tools are you given with this?
For the client, I would say that the major tools are that they are able to see things with a different lens, which is powerful. One of the major ways that I see therapy and have been trained in therapy is that understanding of how many lenses we see the world through. And those lenses are often there to protect us, but they often become very maladaptive. Trauma is one of those pieces, right? When you're traumatized, trauma responses afterwards are lenses to keep us safe, right? So it's becoming aware of those lenses, how those stories are interacting with us, and what then narratives we're living our lives with, right? And a lot of those narratives can be manipulated and shifted by, again, those external sources. So personal heroes are so powerful that way. It doesn't matter what the personal hero is, because they give us an example to live our lives by and compare ourselves to, right? So I would say it's that ability to understand our lenses that we're living with, shift those lenses. I also think that it's about focus too. So a client who is able to, in the moment, think about their particular hero or folk story or whatever it is that we're working with in a situation where they are reacting as opposed to responding, that one then can help to mitigate that situation for them and bring them out of a state, right? I also think that it's about inspiration. I think a lot of people, especially in North America, it's kind of a weird thing because Britain, when it comes to counseling, is slightly different from North America, where the two are very connected. You know, I don't work with mental health issues. I work with all those other pieces that we talked about, right? But the power of hope when it comes to being able to show up, looking at the work of Viktor Frankl, for example, the people in the Holocaust who were able to survive, he saw, were able to find hope even in hopelessness, right? Once we start to deal with hopelessness in our lives and bring that into our lives, then what do we have left to live for, right? There's a lot of issues around that. And so folk tales where there's a happy ending, maybe not Brothers Grimm, we're not talking about the German tales here, but right? When somebody is able to think or believe that there can be a happy ever after for themselves, then that creates hope. And then with that, motivation. So motivation is a huge other piece around that. Now, this is also the other thing too. Folk tales are also very handy for us to understand that sometimes we don't have control in our lives, and that's okay, right? It depends on the folk figure that we're dealing with, what we're looking at. But I mean, folk tales do the same thing for community that folk tales can do for individuals, is that it creates that sense of identity, it creates that sense of hope, and it creates that sense of the boundaries of the world. And so that's the other piece too. Individuals coming away from this type of work can learn for themselves the boundaries of their world and where they can push those boundaries and what boundaries they can't push. So perspective is another big tool that they can develop.
Well, let's move on to your book, because your book is also super fascinating. Ancestral Whispers, a guide to developing ancestral veneration practices. Can you tell us about, the journey to writing this book? How did you come to want to write this book?
Absolutely. So when I was doing my psychotherapy training, one of the big projects that we were doing was around genealogy, and we did something called a genogram, which is a genealogical tree, but it doesn't just track relational information. It tracks things like addictions, subpersonalities, issues, strengths, relationships. It really tracks the whole kind of system of that we're existing in. So ancestor work has always been an interest of mine because I was removed from my extended family in the UK. Over here, it was just my parents and my siblings. So I was really disconnected from the story and the places of those stories over in the UK while being over here. So for me, family wasn't the house that my grandmother lived in. Family for me was the stories that my parents were telling me and the pictures that they were showing me, right? So I became very interested in working with the ancestors as a spiritual practice. And this is different from grief and mourning. Working with the ancestors is as a spiritual approach. It's about seeing these individuals as very much still existing in the universe somewhere, still being able to be accessed, and in that way are still part of the kind of the landscape, that paracosm spiritual landscape that I exist within, and we all exist within. So what I noticed, particularly working within the pagan community, is that because of religious trauma, a lot of neo-pagans are coming from backgrounds where religious trauma with Christianity and official religions. And I would say a lot of spiritual seekers in that way. There's a lot of baggage then around ancestors because those ancestors were all Christians, right? And what often happen is, connecting back with what we were saying about story, folklore becomes very interesting to people because it gives them, and mythology, because it gives them alternatives, first of all, alternative religious ideas and stories to work with apart from Christianity, but it also allows them to connect back with their ancient pagan ancestors. And so you see a lot of glorifying of kind of the past and the ancient as a story to inform their life now. That connection between individual and community, right? So I decided I wanted to write a book, particularly around ancestors, because I didn't see a lot of people writing very good ones. There are some good books out there, but they tend to give people rituals, ways of thinking, all of this. They tend to give people a practice. And for me, spiritual practice needs to be owned. It needs to be developed by yourself because you take ownership of it, and it's more intimate that way. So I sat down during the pandemic because I had nothing else to do, and I started writing the book. This actually came from a course that I did in 2019, and I had a group of about six people the first time, and we were talking about that journey of connecting in with ancestral story, and then these individuals, and then seeing how that story connects with your story now. So it was a wonderful working group. So I sat down and wrote it, and as I got into it deeper and deeper, all of these other pieces came up around, okay, well, we see in the West, we tend to see ancestors as our blood relatives. When you look at other cultures around the world, ancestor is so much more than that. There are many, many different traditions where the ancient gods were actually ancestors, and they're treated as such. They're treated as great-grandfather, great-grandmother, right? The landscape around is created. You see this a lot in Indigenous American, Indigenous Australian. The landscape around was created by these deities and these spirits and these ancestors. And so when you're walking through any homeland, you're seeing that mountain there was created by the great rainbow serpent, who is really great-great-grandfather to everybody, right? Or the great bison, who's, so on and so on, right? Whatever symbol, whatever story is. And so, again, it's that breaking the fourth wall. People are able to enter into their landscapes and connect with that space, knowing that, okay, thousands of years ago, whenever that was, at some point in the distant past, this mountain was created, this river was forged, this sinkhole, whatever it is, right? And so I started to then work with the idea of different forms of ancestor. When you look at culture now, the connections between communities can be very different depending on where you are. I was on a podcast the other day, and we were talking that the young woman is from New Jersey, but her background is Jamaican, English, and Ghanaian. In West African and Caribbean culture, people have a lot more aunties and uncles than they're biologically related to, but those family connections are still there, regardless. And so those people, those individuals, those ancestors become important for the story of the community, and then individuals finding themselves within that context of the story of the community. So what my book is it is an invitation for people to explore this for themselves. I ask a lot of questions in the book. I don't give them ritual to do. I don't tell them how to worship their ancestors, because readers are going to be coming from all sorts of different spiritual backgrounds. It's not my place to tell you how to believe. But it is my place to do is ask you, how do you believe? Where does that worldview come from? How does your relationships emerge from that worldview? In the same way that I would work with folklore stories, right? This is the word that this folk culture is promoting. You're part of that folk culture. How is that folk culture and that worldview informing your relationships with the characters and the individuals in that folklore, right? It's a cyclical thing in the same way. So that's what this is. It takes you through various parts of a lived spiritual practice, such as kind of when you're building a sacred space, what is going on for you in that process? What is the intention there? How is it communicating with spirits of the ancestors? When it comes to kind of leaving offerings, how is that coming from worldview, and so on and so on. It's inviting readers to not see the dead as just dead and gone, but as individuals that they can access on every single day of their life, whether it be through the stories that are left in the family, whether it be through actually, if you believe, seeing the spirits and connecting with the dead spirits directly, whether it be then seeing them in yourself. How are these stories and how are these individuals, what they've gave to you, how is that showing up in your life, and how have you then progressing it down into
and
the next generation?
So I know that in your book you probably walk people through steps, but how would I decide what ancestors I want to give venerations? Is that the word? Is that another word for worship, or what does that word mean exactly?
Well, so this is where it becomes a fraught issue, because worship and veneration in English has very specific religious connotations, right? And a lot of specific kind of ideas of what we shouldn't be doing with those words. When you look at other cultures, in non-English cultures, the distinction between veneration and worship is not as distinct. If you go to a Chinese restaurant and you see an ancestor shrine, the idea of the relationship between the individuals and the ancestors is different, because the conception of an ancestor is different. In many ways, the founding father or founding mother of families are worshipped as deities, because they are mini deities, right? Through the process of that relationship, right? So we put veneration here as a way of relating it more to venerating saints, but worship could very well also, you could worship your ancestors depending upon how you see them, what you see has happened to them, what power they suddenly have because they're dead, and so on and so on. In Haitian voodoo, for example, people do worship the dead, because those by the process of dying, they've now ascended into a much more powerful state in the world, right? So when you're working with the ancestral dead, you are worshiping them because they're worthy of being worshipped, right? So it really depends on kind of where you're seeing them.
And so would you say that there's a distinction between veneration and worship then?
I would say in English that there is. I would say that in the English context, in our cultural context, because of Judeo-Christianity, I would say that individuals who are living within a monotheistic worldview, venerating the dead is acknowledging that they have a different special relationship with the spiritual than God does. And so God would be worthy of being worshipped because he's the creator of the universe, versus the dead who are sitting next to God. This particularly comes up in Mormonism, this comes up in Catholicism. You would venerate the saints because the belief is that the saints have the ear of God, that they can become more intimate intercessors, right? In the same way that the dead would be. But I'm not telling anybody how to believe in this book. What I'm saying is, figure that out for yourself. Think about your worldview. Think about the culture you come from. Really think, because so much, and I'm sure you've seen this from many of your other guests and experienced it yourself, so much of what we think of as culture is so subliminal and subconscious, we're not even aware of it until it's pointed out.
Yeah, that's one of the things I discovered when I was traveling. That was one of the first things that really stuck out, is that there were so many things that I did that I didn't realize that were cultural. And I didn't recognize it until I saw other people doing something entirely different, and realizing that it was just because this is how I grew up, and this is, it was just something that I learned. It was a learned behavior, but I didn't realize that was not everywhere in the world.
It's daunting, isn't it? It's weird for me because I came to Canada when I was such a young kid, that I'm culturally I'm Canadian, right? I've been over here 28 years. I'm actually, if you see all the boxes behind me, I'm actually in the process of moving to the UK next year. So I'm already seeing, as home has always been home to me, right? Even though I've lived here for so long. But even now I'm noticing that when I, something that really drives me nuts is the British tendency of not being direct. North Americans are so direct when it comes to things. So I asked a friend a question, and he pussyfooted around, and he said, "Just tell me."
Yeah,
that's cultural,
absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, that's so funny. Okay, so let's say, how would I find what ancestors I would want to venerate?
Of course. So most people, I would say, in the Western world, the first way that they start connecting with ancestors is through genealogical research, ancestral story. And if you've ever done that before, I don't know if have you ever done that before?
My aunt has done some ancestral tree, but I haven't really studied it very much.
Of course. It's something that you're either really, really into it, or it's just something that is just not.
I'm glad she did it. I'm glad she did the work, but because that is not something that I really want to dive into. But so I'm glad that we have this already laid out for me.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because in every community you always have those holders of that oral knowledge, right? And so we see this coming up even in society now. You have the people who are really interested in learning and gaining those stories in order to then share with the rest of the family, right? I happen to be one of those people in my family, and so, but it's very telling that we're often interested in the stories of our ancestors, and learning about that, because those stories then relate back to us, right, in a very direct way. The stuff that, when I did my genealogical research, it was very fascinating to see that the issues that are happening in my family now and that we've grown up with started almost 5 generations ago. You can see the connection down the line. And so a lot of people start with that. Traditional cultures have those oral traditions already involved. They have those rituals already there. And so there's no need to necessarily learn about the ancestors, because the ancestors are always present. The shrines are filled with images of the ancestors. And so if you want to learn about it, you just go and sit at the shrine and you see the way the shrine is created, right? That tells you and informs you about the ancestors. Same with, in Mexican culture, the beautiful ofrendas during the Day of the Dead, you can tell intimately, being part of those cultures, who the great-great-grandparents are, who the grandparents are, just based on where they are located on the shrine, right? So I would say most people start with genealogical research. I think that's a good way to do it. And then it's taking it beyond that. It's actually maybe going to those places that those ancestors come from. And a lot of people do that too. I know down in Texas, there's a lot of Germans and Scottish and Irish people, descended people. And the number of people who they want to go back to the UK, or they want to go back to Ireland, or they want to go to Europe, or wherever they come, their ancestors come from, that feeling, that need to go home is powerful. I think you had somebody talking about pilgrimage a couple
Jim
of
Hindle.
episodes. Yes. Jim Hingle. I haven't had a chance to. I've been trying to listen to some of your episodes just to prepare myself for this. And with pilgrimage, and I talk about pilgrimage in there, pilgrimage is directly relating, bringing down the fourth wall between you and the story of your ancestors. That's essentially what it comes down to, is breaking the fourth wall. How you do that is entirely up to you. But there's something about actually walking in the landscape, knowing that your ancestors come from that place, that there's a connection, there's something. It's almost like going back to your your childhood home. Even if somebody else is living there, there's still that connection of, I came from this place.
What do you feel like the catalyst is for people who decide to connect with their ancestors?
It's a very good question. I think for Westerners, of what I've seen, there's probably many, many, many other ones, but of what I've seen is that feeling of disconnection. It's that feeling of needing to know. It's that needing to explore yourself through this process of learning about the ancestors. And I think it's also that feeling of needing to be grounded, right? When this relates directly back to folklore and folk culture, when you exist in a small community and your ancestors have lived in that community and done the same traditions, celebrated the same holidays, told the same stories about haints and boogies and all of these creatures and spirits and so on and so on, there's no need for you to feel connected to those stories because it's already there. I think when we all started to move away from our home regions and move into the cities where we don't have those connections anymore, I think that's one of the reasons that people really started to seek again that connection back again, right? I think for other communities, it's a sense of finding personal power. A very good example of that would be the African American community. The reason that African American cemeteries are so important in African American culture is because those are the places that the ancestors are buried, right? You may not know the names because the society didn't allow you to record those names, but you know that those are the spaces that your ancestors are buried. And that becomes then about life, your life and their life, not about their death, right?
Yeah.
If that makes sense. So I think that, and I would say that also the immigrant experience too, because so many, and you've probably heard this from some of your other guests, so many folk cultures dissipated or were lost, or those traditions disappeared because of migration, or changed, right? So if you don't come from a very strong culture like in the Ozarks or Appalachia or in Texas, like the German communities down in on the Gulf Coast in Texas there, they come from all over Germany, but they've cobbled together a really powerful German Texas identity, right? If you don't belong to those sorts of cultures and you are in the middle of a city that you've just moved to, where's the connection? Right? So I would say those are the three major pieces.
Absolutely. So can you tell us some examples of rituals that people do for ancestral veneration?
Of course, definitely. So it depends on the culture, but one of the more widespread ones would be celebrating the Day of the Dead for a lot of European-based cultures or European-inspired cultures. So going into the cemetery, spending time with the dead, and decorating, very widespread. People in North America don't realize that what is happening in Mexico with the Day of the Dead and celebrating and decorating in the cemeteries is actually something that goes on in Poland, in Italy, in parts of Germany. It goes on over there too, and that's because of that Catholic piece. Some of the other ancestral kind of ways people celebrate, again, it depends on culture, but in a lot of Caribbean folk religions and smaller religions, African-based religions, the entire month of November is often devoted to the dead.
Wow.
And that actually, when you look at it, makes a lot of sense cosmologically, because in the northern and western hemisphere, November tends to come just after the harvest. And so already cosmologically, death is starting to take place, winter is starting to come, the kind of winter season, right? So November is a very particular time. Some of the religious approaches of working with the dead are feeding them. That's a very, 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 very old one. That idea, that belief that the dead are in their afterlife and are continually needing to be supported by the living. So we see this in ancient Egypt. We see this in India. We see this particularly around the lunar, not the Lunar New Year. In the Chinese and a lot of Asian cultures, it's actually offering the dead, and a really cool thing that they do, at least in some cultures, is that they will buy paper outfits or paper cars or paper money especially, and they will burn it with the belief that by burning it, it's being transformed and sent into the spirit world. And so you see these huge big stalls created of like luxury goods, like cell phones. If your great grandmother really needs a cell phone in the afterlife, because and it's funny because culturally, like over here, we have such a detachment from the dead because of secularism, the funeral industry. But if you think of the worldview, okay, then it makes complete sense. If the ancestors are still very connected to this world, even if they're in the spirit world, and they have the potential to, mess things up for you if you stop, venerating them, then you're going to want your great-grandma or your great-grandfather or your grandparents to have the best that you can get. And so people can buy houses, people can buy cars, all paper, and then they go through ritually burning them, and it becomes like a celebration. It's fantastic, Yeah. So really a lot of different things and different ways. In my own spiritual practice, I was connected with an African tradition at Santeria Lukumi, and it was a little bit more intimate than that. Working with the dead was a daily thing. We have a little shrine in the corner near the back door symbolic of kind of going of exits, right? Which makes sense. Death is an exit. But whenever I cook food and whenever people cook food, we would give them a spoonful of that food as an offering and say, I thank you for the life that you gave me, and this is some of my effort back to you, right? Just sitting with the ancestors, speaking with the ancestors, connecting with the ancestors. Among paganism, there's one now called the Dumb Supper, which is to go and sit in a cafe-like environment, and the space across from you is empty for the ancestors. So you just commune with the ancestors, spend time with them, thinking about them, remembering them, thinking about the stories. So all sorts of different things.
So when you're doing this, is there like a specific person that you're speaking with, or are you speaking with a group? How does that work? How are you visualizing who it is you're giving food to or having a conversation with?
Well, it can be both. So in large group rituals or gatherings, the food is placed down for all of the ancestors. If I'm celebrating a particular ancestor, or I have a particular ancestor in mind, I might put down a particular food connected to them specifically. So if I'm deciding to, make a meal and the dessert is a particular dessert that a particular ancestor, my grandmother, made, then I would honor that particular relationship with her by giving it to all of the others, right? So again, it depends on kind of what you're focusing on. I know that some people will celebrate particular birthdays, and then that becomes a particular birthday celebration, even if the person is already dead. You see this a lot in Mexican culture. So you can have ofrendas and shrines built to a particular person, and then everything on that shrine will be reminding of that person. So it could be an heirloom, it could be their favorite food, their favorite liquor, whatever it is. And you often find that on the anniversary of that person's death, if they died the year before or 2 years before, that person becomes the focus. So it depends. In large kind of thinking about the ancestors, I tend to think of them collectively. It's not only easier that way, but also because it denotes then I'm the product of all of them. And we're talking about blood relatives here. When it comes to other form of ancestor, it could be as simple as having, like, if you're in a particular profession, having a bust or a portrait of a particular person who was important to that. So a lot of writers, for example, are really connected with Shakespeare because of that. A lot of actors are very connected with Shakespeare because of that connection. And so you might have a special space devoted to Shakespeare or something honoring. Many towns in Canada, the United States, they'll have founders statues in their town centers, right? And I know at this point in our history, the concept of founders, there's a lot of issues around settler culture and the destruction of the indigenous people. But that was a community focus. If we see it through the lens of ancestor worship, then the founder becomes a particular focal point for the whole community. And so venerating the founder or celebrating the founder in Founders' Days or whatever become then a celebration of the whole. So there's different ways.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. What if you don't really feel connection with your ancestors? If you have maybe disdain, maybe if your ancestors were slaveholders, or you really didn't feel like they were people that you wanted to venerate, do you just suggest finding other people, or how would you suggest if someone really didn't feel a connection?
Absolutely. If somebody doesn't feel connection with their ancestors or wanting to work with their ancestors at all, I would say don't force it, right? You don't have to. You don't have to, But if you are interested in working with the ancestors, then I would say part of that journey then is to come to a relationship with yourself, with that individual. If you find an ancestor that you just don't connect with, or that turned out to be did horrific things in life, part of that journey then for you will be, how do you then respond to that person? There's nothing in this book that tells you what you have to do. Only considerations. There's only considerations. So if that individual created the society or helped create the community that you're in now, which is a common thing for a lot of people, their ancestor was ones who founded communities, then it's understanding then you are benefiting from the thing that they did. Then what can you do in your life now, and to take responsibility for that? How can you help to make the next generation better? Sometimes that could be actually educating yourself even more on that individual to understand then, okay, what have they done and how is it here? I'll give a more personal example here. So I when I was sitting down with my mom and dad, when I was sitting down with my mom, who was really the holder of a lot of stories in the family, she used to tell me that my grandfather, who I have one memory of, he passed away when I was about 4, so I really don't have many memories of him. But she used to tell me that he was very hard on my dad, that he was always expecting perfection from my dad. Like, my dad built a wall once, built a wooden wall for the neighbor, and he went and got his dad, and he said, "Dad, look at what I've done." Yes, very good, yeah. Rip it down and rebuild it. It's not perfect, right? Like,
yeah.
Right? So for me, I got this impression that my grandfather was this really hard individual, really like perfectionist, and needed, like, was really driving my father. Yeah, I speak to my dad's cousin, and she said he was the warmest individual who gave the best hugs and the most wise counsel. So suddenly I have these two stories of this individual. One is not so great, one is all great, right? Where's the connection between those two? Well, in understanding it, different relationships, but also different agendas. So I engaged with a dumb supper, and I invited my grandfather to come in. And whether your viewers believe that this happened, I believe it happened. I believe that it was a real thing for me. But I imagined that my grandfather came, and we almost entered into like it's hard to describe. It was almost like entering into another room, kind of like an overlay of reality. And I could hear him, and we were having a conversation. And I said to him, "Granddad, why were you so like this with my dad?" And he said, "You have to understand. I didn't know now what I knew back then, or what I didn't know back then what I knew now, right? I didn't know how that would affect your dad. I just wanted the best for him, right?" And knowing that he's progressed, at least in this belief system, that he's progressed from that point, I allowed myself to let go of that uncomfortable feeling around him and just embrace him as an ancestor. Now, embracing and understanding is not the same as condoning behavior. So I think that's that piece, and that's a journey for many people. I actually offer ancestral counseling around these things. When somebody finds a story like that in their family tree, what do you do with that? How does that affect you? Because of that relationship between identity and group identity, right? How then is that going to throw your personal sense of self into question? And is this thing threatening your sense of self and who you are? Because we can over-identify with those stories, right?
Absolutely. Well, I feel like we could talk about this all day, but I did want to give you some space to talk about the Salem Festival, Folk Life Festival that you are going to be speaking at soon. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Yes, of course. So people can go to my Facebook page or my website, and they'll have details of that. So the Salem Folklore and Witchcraft Festival is happening over the weekend of August 4th. I'm at 10 a.m. And I'm going to be speaking about the relationship between story and folklore and landscape. So I'll be talking about how folk culture tends to relate to physical landscape, how it tends to anchor itself in landscape, and how communities tend to connect with landscape. And then, that being said, how then you can relate to your own landscape in a different way. How can you form your own stories and connect in landscape? I'll be discussing the psychological brain mapping and how our brains tend to, through association with symbol and geospatial dynamics, how that works. So it's more of a look at the foundations and the functions of folklore and how folklore operates on a landed scale. There are going to be speakers from all over the place: England, Australia, and North America, speaking from very particular folklore. So a friend of mine, Brett, is going to be talking about the regional folklore of the borders in Wales. There's also a friend of mine, Moss, who's going to be talking about German folklore. There's some of the biggest names in folklore studies, or at least from kind of witchcraft studies, going to be speaking there. Jesse Hathaway, Charles Porterfield, and I believe David Rankin is also going to be there. So if your audience knows who they are, they can go to salemwitchfest.com, or just looking up Salem Folklore Festival.
Now this is all online,
so you can buy. And it's all online, yes. So that's the other a major thing too. It's all online, and the recordings will be available after for, I believe, until the end of December. So people can still buy tickets for those and look into them. I believe there's over 30 guests, and I believe 40 presentations over the span of the weekend. So it's fantastic. I'm really looking forward to it.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has just been such a fascinating conversation.
Thank you. It's something very important to my heart, and I will say I'm going to be continuing my journey through this. I'm actually in the process of applying to study at the master's level, a folklore studies master's in the UK.
Oh, and that's why you're moving to the UK right now.
To that, and really bridging everything that we've talked about today into that.
And thank you, folksy folks, for joining us on our journey today to learn more about the use of folklore and mythology in therapy, as well as how to create practices to connect with our ancestors. All the links that we talked about, which were a lot, will be on our website, which is www.fabricoffolklore.com, including the book that Ben has just put out and his website. Have you used therapy yourself in folktales or using mythology? Would it work well for you, do you think? Do you have ancestral practices that you already utilize? We want to hear from you. We have a Facebook community page specifically for that. So it's a Fabric of Folklore podcast community. And that is where we continue the conversation, where you can share with us your thoughts about the show, about your experiences, about what we have talked about today. So we definitely want to hear from you. And that is that is a place where we invite you to come. So if you've enjoyed today, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, because it is so helpful for a new podcast. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. If you review us, I will give you a shout out. It is absolutely one of the best things that you can do if you enjoy our show. And thanks for unraveling the mysteries of folklore with us. And until next time, keep the folk alive.